Hello from Frederick Community College, Mid-Atlantic Center for Emergency Management and Public Safety. I'm Kathy Francis, Executive Director, and I represent a talented group of individuals providing academic, contract, and professional services nationwide. Today, I'm here to reinforce that partnerships matter. Join me to welcome Anthem Planning as our outstanding partner on the Collaborative Public Safety Technology Interview Series.
Kathy, thank you for having us again. I'm Amy Laporte with Anthem Planning. Anthem offers clients a full suite of emergency communications and emergency management services, including technology assessment and project management. I had a wonderful time during our interview last week with Andrew Owlett, and I have been looking forward to speaking with Anne today. Anne, thank you so much for being here with us.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me.
Absolutely. So just a little bit about you. And then I'll let you expand a bit on that. But so I've had the great benefit of working with some of Anne's colleagues at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University and had an understanding of how engaged their researchers are on all topics surrounding disaster. So I was thrilled to be introduced to Anne's research. Anne is an Internet Law and Policy Foundry Fellow with the Internet Education Foundation and has worked as a technology fellow at the R Street Institute and as a public policy associate at Facebook. Research focuses on policy issues associated with emerging technologies, including AI, virtual and augmented reality, and cybersecurity. Anne's work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Slate, and The Hill. And so we asked her to come here today to speak with us a little bit about privacy risk and mesh networks for public safety. You can learn more about Anne at annhobson.com after this interview. But Anne, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. My career has mainly been in technology policy with a specific interest in how consumer devices can create value for individuals, from smartphones to virtual reality headsets. And I became interested in emergency response by osmosis, actually. My supervisor, Dr. Stephanie Hafley, has experience at FEMA, and that informs her academic research on disaster response and recovery. She graciously included me in that research agenda as well. And one of the mechanisms that we found that communities use to respond and recover is technology. People rely on communications networks and social media to coordinate about needs, the location of resources, and the health of family members, especially in today's coronavirus pandemic. But one of the biggest concerns with technology right now is privacy risk. And it's one of the top concerns of state and federal lawmakers.
Anne, thank you for joining us today. And given your research background, can you talk a little bit about the current regulatory environment? What do public safety personnel need to know about privacy risk?
Yeah, so data privacy describes the practices which ensure that data is only used for its intended purpose. Privacy is a bit of an enigma because it's subjective. So, for example, I was speaking to a European friend in Spain who made the following comment. She was like, "What is it with you Americans always volunteering information about yourself?" And I had just introduced myself and where I'm from. And so reflecting upon that, we were laughing about it. But basically, there are different cultures and even families have different privacy preferences and behaviors. So another factor is what's creepy today may also not be creepy tomorrow. So when first cameras became ubiquitous, people were worried that other people would run rampant taking pictures of strangers in public. But in reality, norms evolved so that most people don't walk up to someone and take a picture of them. And we don't think of seeing someone now as, when they're taking a picture, as creepy or strange. So the US legal system uses a helpful term, I think. It's called PII, or personally identifiable information. PII includes a broad category of personal identifiers: an individual's social security number, a tax ID number, or biometric data when it's paired with a first name or a last name. And biometric data includes things like fingerprints or images of your face. And if you collect this type of data or interact with databases that contain it, you should be aware that it falls into a riskier legal category. So at the federal level, there are a few comprehensive data privacy bills under consideration. California passed a Privacy Act at the state level that requires businesses to make data practices explicit and give people the means to delete personal information. This bill would not apply to law enforcement, but it does highlight where future regulatory requirements are headed. Organizational best practices now include things like notifying individuals about what information is collected, used, and also shared in the way that it's shared. Many other states have introduced similar bills targeting PII. So the idea behind specifying different categories of privacy is that an organization knowing or a bad actor knowing one's credit score is very different, and credit information is very different than knowing your ice cream preference. Those are two very different things and have different consequences for what individuals do with that knowledge and can do with that knowledge. So the information held in 911 call centers or law enforcement record keeping systems, these contain PII. And if you collect this type of data, there should be processes in place to ensure that it is not tampered with, especially. The NIST Institute for Standards and Technology created a cybersecurity framework, and that's one resource I think is very good at walking organizations through how to identify risky practices and risky data and protect it, detect when a breach has occurred, and also help them respond and recover. All federal agencies have to be compliant with this framework, and there are many resources available that can guide people that are interested in building robust cybersecurity and privacy practices. Another thing to note is that all 50 states have data breach notification laws. So data breach notification laws require organizations to tell individuals when their personal data has been exposed. So for example, in Maryland, if the business determines that a data breach creates the likelihood that that personal information has been or will be misused, then that organization has to provide notice as soon as possible. Lastly, the most prominent agency in the US privacy regulation space is the Federal Trade Commission. So the FTC, they are in charge of preventing unfair and deceptive practices for most organizations. And if an organization violates their own terms of service in terms of privacy, then the FTC can take action against them. So as you can see, the regulatory landscape is complex and it's fast moving too, but there are some, these are some of the high points that I think are helpful for security personnel.
That's excellent, Anne. Thank you so much. So many of our audience members are members of the first responder community or may plan a career in the first responder community. Can you provide a framework for how those folks might think about privacy and risk in light of the data stored on public safety systems and in light of the data that they will interact with in their careers?
Yes. So risk mitigation is a task that's ongoing and evolving. As I mentioned, privacy is a pretty big concern for organizations these days. So reevaluating an organization's risk posture at regular intervals is critical. And that's something that I think the NIST framework does really well. And that's the framework that I would encourage organizations to follow. So one key resource to help organizations think about it, that I will seek to add these resources to the conversation as we go forward. I believe you're going to distribute some of them in some form. But it acknowledges that the importance of, that it's important to have constant vigilance, this framework. It also focuses on organizational learning, risk reassessment in the data processing ecosystem, and it establishes a common language through which to evaluate privacy risk. And that's where I think a lot of the added value comes, because it really, for many people, this is not something they think of when they think of law enforcement or when they think of public safety. I also like this framework because it recognizes that privacy is a ubiquitous concern that evolves over time, and that a one-size-fits-all law or regulation in this space would affect different parts of the ecosystem differently. And it also recognizes that our privacy preferences themselves evolve over time. So what is considered PII, personally identifiable information, one day may change as technology changes. So for example, one's walking gait, the way that you walk, is now considered personally identifiable information when attached to a name, because cameras and machine learning can pick up on one's gait, and that can have consequences for privacy down the road. One other thing to mention is that there's a duty of confidentiality relevant for first responders and law enforcement, who often become aware of private and intimate facts about their patients and others. So inaccurate disclosure of that information, things like defamation and slander, or making an assumption about a patient's condition, that disclosure could be necessary as part of the job, but it's also very sensitive. So for example, a first responder that's handing off a patient to paramedics would and should tell individuals involved that the patient has said, for example, that they might have a positive COVID-19 diagnosis. But telling that same information to a reporter or even a family member that's around or a friend would be an invasion of the privacy of the patient.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you for helping improve our understanding of privacy concerns. We'd like to get into your research a little bit on mesh networks. Can you talk to us a little bit about the potential for mesh networks to add to resilience in communications?
Yeah, I think mesh networks are particularly interesting because they can facilitate communication when traditional networks are down. Because mesh networks are operating device to device rather than relying on cell towers, they're resilient to outages caused by forest fires, for example, or tornadoes or hurricanes. I remember back actually in high school in Illinois, our area got hit by a microburst. It's a very powerful localized storm, and it knocked down trees and electric wires, and it flooded the streets. And everyone was trying to call home at once, and the cell lines were completely blocked. And only the occasional text could get through. And I hadn't realized that cellular networks were that vulnerable to such a disruption. So mesh networks themselves, those capabilities are critical for communicating with one's family and with emergency services after an event such as that. So mesh networks consist of a direct peer-to-peer communication that relies on connectivity between nodes. So nodes could be cell phones, they can be smart devices, some look like walkie-talkies, others look like routers, internet routers, but that's what they do is they route signals. And those could be Wi-Fi or Bluetooth or something else. And so I first learned of mesh networks actually several years ago conducting research in Cuba. It turns out that Cubans only got mobile data access last year. So in order to share photos or to get new apps, what they would do is use a mesh networking app called Zappia. And this allowed you to see other users in the area using your own phone's local Wi-Fi signal to interact with the content that they were sharing via Zappia. So in a mesh network, data travels to the recipient by bouncing off of the devices in between. And unlike those standard communication networks, the failure of any single node will only have a minimal effect on users because the other nodes can quickly route messages around that failure. So this makes them particularly resilient, whether you're in Cuba or in a post-disaster environment. One last thing I wanted to mention is an app called FireChat. It's an example of a mesh networking app that you can have on your phone today if you wanted, and it's free. It also works without Wi-Fi or mobile coverage, and there's professional versions of these things too. So Gotenna creates the Gotenna Pro, and that's intended more for military use or even for use by public safety personnel. And it operates in spectrum reserved for public safety radio communications. It uses also end-to-end encryption, which means that only the sender and the recipient can see the message. It can send messages for up to 4 miles between nodes. So these are some of the technologies that we're talking about that could be really helpful for public safety personnel.
So Anne, as mesh networks emerge into the public safety market, we know there are challenges in terms of regulation and full implementation of the technology. So what are the challenges that folks should be aware of?
Yeah, there's some notable challenges like battery life and the need for line of sight transmission. So nodes and relay devices work best if they aren't blocked by buildings or if they have access to a node in the system that's very high up. But our cellular networks also sometimes face similar problems. I think because some of the more tactical mesh networks operate in these radio bands I mentioned that are reserved for public safety, traditionally you or your organization are supposed to have a license to operate in those bands. However, it's difficult to enforce that practice, and there's a bit of legal uncertainty surrounding that. Do I need a license or don't I? And that means that I think less people are willing to adopt the product. And so one other critical aspect is this, what my co-author and I found. Walter Stover is my co-author at Mercatus on a couple of mesh network pieces that I hope to share with all of you. But basically we found that because they operate in this legal and regulatory gray area, interpretations of FCC over the airway rules, so current Federal Communications Commission rules regarding airwaves, this can actually end up permitting municipalities and other organizations to be able to veto where people can place nodes. and that would limit the effectiveness of the network as a whole. Another current regulatory barrier has to do with spectrum licensing. So the FCC currently uses auctions to allocate spectrum. However, those auctions often favor big established companies who have the cash to make a bid. And many startups operate in public bands, which are subject to interference from using those same bands. Like when you hear two radio stations when you're flipping through and they overlap on one another. So I think like at the end of the day, mesh networks will be key to resilience of communication systems in post-disaster environments. I'm really excited for them to become mainstream.
So Anne, thank you for being a part of our interview series. We have brought the best and the brightest minds in the field together to help break down some of these fast-moving technologies, and we appreciate your contribution today. You're helping us to keep tabs on industry trends, and you're helping to enhance agencies' abilities to respond. So to our audience, join us every week for your Monday briefing on the tips and the tricks from our experts to help make you implement technology just that much easier. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Anne.